Welcome to You Can't Say That in Court, a podcast by Rise Women's Legal Center. I'm Vicky Law.
And I'm Stephanie Melnick. We are your hosts in this conversation about survivors of violence navigating the BC family law system. We recognize that this system is colonial and causes harm to families, and that disproportionately impacts Indigenous people.
By speaking more widely about these harms, we hope to raise awareness about the challenges that survivors face as they navigate the colonial family law system. This podcast is our attempt to collectively identify the barriers and ask for positive changes to be made. Thank you for joining us. Our podcast series will discuss difficult topics such as gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, including physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Please be aware that this is a thread that is woven throughout all the episodes, and we hope that you will take care of yourselves however you need. This is episode 1, and today we're talking about family violence and coercive controlling behavior. So we wanted to address why are we here and why are we doing this podcast. So my first point is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding amongst the public about family violence or intimate partner violence. Specifically, I think a lot of people assume that there is a hierarchy of violence. And what I mean by hierarchy of violence is that certain types of violence, such as physical or sexual abuse, could be considered more threatening or more dangerous than other forms of violence. And we know that with working with the clients and the women that we serve at Rise, that that's not the case. That there's also other forms of violence, including coercive and controlling behavior, which we'll get into in a little bit moment. But yeah, we want to address this big myth that physical and sexual abuse is considered worse, or what's another word that I'm looking for?
It's easier to prove, right? Like that.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, I think that's why it bubbles to the surface or to the top of the list, is just because it's normally physical evidence that can be shown. So yeah, but it suggests that it's more important or more serious than other forms of abuse. And we are here to say that is not true.
No, it is not true at all. And we also want to address the gendered aspect of these types of violence. We know that women and gender diverse folks are overwhelmingly victims of intimate partner violence. And this is why we use gendered language. And so this is just to let everyone know we're going to use a lot of she and her or they and them pronouns, and that is to recognize that women and gender diverse individuals overwhelmingly experience IPV or intimate partner violence. So the next piece we want to address is coercive and controlling behavior. What is it? Why is it such a big thing? I know a lot of people are talking about it. There's legislation passed or being passed considering coercive controlling behavior as a criminal offense with the federal government in Canada right now. So yeah, let's spend some time talking about this.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a thread that weaves through a lot of our episodes, because it is a hard concept to grasp in some ways, but in other ways, a lot of people are recognizing how much more common it is than it's been in the past. And the key piece that I really appreciate about this term, or I guess this category of violence, is how it's looking at behavior over time, looking at a collection of actions and seeing a pattern. I think makes a lot more sense to a lot of people, because things don't happen in isolation. One bad event or incident isn't really making up the whole picture in a relationship that might be toxic or might be abusive.
Yeah. And I think maybe the best way to understand this would be through some examples. And so one of the key examples that I always think of is financial control or financial abuse, because it's like more easily understood. And so it's very common for families and couples to pool their collective salaries together into one joint account. And that on its own may not be financial control or financial abuse. But we have heard lots of people coming to us saying, yeah, all the money that I earned is put into this joint bank account, and I have to go and ask him for permission to use something, to buy something for the groceries or for the children, or he gives me kind of like an allowance of like $20 a week so that I can't use more than that.
Yeah, we hear a lot about allowances, about being given permission, but also even just a really small comment that someone might say, like, oh, I can't access that account, or, my money gets put into account that I don't have access to. That's a red flag right there. Just hearing that someone has no access to the family money, it's really disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard. And I think financial abuse is often there's also other types of abuse that comes into play, and it's not just financial abuse. So the other one that I often think of is isolation of the individual from their family and friends, so that they don't have a support network to lean on when things do get bad. So one of the examples that I think is, well, let me preface by saying this, that like family dynamics are hard. We
Yeah.
all
Oh,
know
yeah.
that family
Absolutely.
dynamics are hard. And just because your partner doesn't get along with your parents or your siblings doesn't mean that there's abuse.
Yeah, totally.
So just want to say that.
Yeah.
And there are situations where the perpetrator may put a survivor in a situation where there is controlling or coercion, such as making them choose between the family or themselves. So one scenario that I can think of is I knew someone who, like, their partner didn't want to go on family trips with them. She was
Right.
responsible with going on the trips and taking the children with her to go on these trips. And so that placed her in kind of a difficult situation of choosing between him or going and spending time with her family and friends and taking the children with her. So there's a huge imbalance of responsibilities in that scenario. Um, and there's an imbalance of power there.
Yeah, it always makes me think of how hard it is to recognize it from the outside. If a mother, for example, is taking her kids on vacation to meet up with family, on its surface, it doesn't necessarily look problematic in any way. But I think the idea of coercive and controlling behavior allows us to use a little bit of a gut feel as well, so that if that same mom is on vacation and kind of says a couple of things and they just don't land, where like, her sister is like, he didn't come because, whatever the reason is that she gives, and it just sounds unusual or raises kind of red flags or something. It just allows us to collect a lot of information over time to create this picture of, yeah, this is not healthy, what's happening. And my sister, my friend, my mother, whoever it might be, really doesn't have the freedom that they used to have. As a person outside the relationship, you can sometimes notice those restrictions on their freedom. And then if you're someone in the relationship and you feel caught between your partner and your family, or your partner and your friends, that is also something that's just going to feel, gut feel wrong, that you can't have both somehow. Yeah, it's really tricky. I was thinking about a client that I had who had this very doting partner, abusive ex now, who wanted to buy her a new vehicle and kind of brokered the sale of her previous vehicle. And then whenever he was upset with her, he would steal the keys, feeling like it was his right to take the keys away, because he was the one that purchased the vehicle, so to speak. And it kind of created two problems. One was that financial control again, but it also created isolation. She couldn't leave the house and go see friends or family or get away or anything. And so some of these things can layer up as well. And again, it's really helpful to look at it as a pattern and try to step back and say, what is actually happening here? Is someone trying to keep someone else under their control.
Yeah, transportation is a huge one, especially for folks who are living in more rural communities and more remote areas where public
Yeah.
transportation isn't like readily available, or taxis or Uber and Lyfts, right? Like
Yeah.
it's a necessity to have your own personal vehicle to get around. And we have seen transportation being used as a method of coercive and control over and over again.
Yeah. Another piece of the controlling behavior that often strikes me is how it happens in little baby steps, like in increments. I can think of an example where someone was on their honeymoon with their new husband and she didn't have a really good spot. She thought she lost her wallet and she didn't have a really good spot to put it. And so she ended up giving it to him because his backpack was better for carrying her wallet for safekeeping. And then she never saw her credit cards again. It was just like this. It was the first step on a road to him controlling how she spent money, when she was allowed to have money. And it just, when looking back on that example, it's like it seems so innocuous right in the beginning, like so innocent. It's like, oh, I thought, we're traveling around Europe and I thought I lost my wallet. Here, you can keep it for me. And then that was just the beginning of the end of freedom around finances that way. Also, I feel like financial controlling behavior or financial abuse is a bit hard in our society because oftentimes there's one person in a relationship who maybe has more of a handle on the family finances and they kind of take a lead on it. Like most of us have someone who does the tax returns or something like that. And so it doesn't seem odd that one person might appear more controlling. So again, I guess this gets into the murky waters of how hard it is to recognize coercive and controlling behavior, but financial abuse is, I think, extremely prevalent. What we hear from a lot of clients is that there's almost always an element of financial abuse.
Yeah, and we will get into how do we identify abuse in our future episodes. But we're going down a rabbit hole, so
Right?
let's not
Yes.
get into there
Let's keep
right
moving.
now.
Yeah, fair.
Okay, so now we want to spend some time to talk about some of the myths around intimate partner violence or family violence. And one of the most common, most, I guess, asked about question is, why doesn't she leave him? Why doesn't she just go if things are that bad, if things are abusive? Why doesn't she just leave?
Yeah.
Um,
I think we're going to get into why that's so complicated, but on the surface, that's the most obvious question, right? It's like, if things are bad, just get out of there. And thinking that for a friend or a family member is natural, but it's way more complicated than that. Yeah.
yeah, I think part of the reason why we ask that, or a lot of us thinks, like, if my sister was in this situation, she would just go. Why doesn't she just go? But the reality is that things may not get better after the separation, and in fact, there's a lot of things that could get worse. We are in a housing crisis. So number one question is,
Exactly.
like, where is this person and their children gonna go if they
Mhm.
leave their family home? And then there's the other question was like, well, she doesn't have to leave, she's entitled to stay there. Why doesn't the abuser go? And I
Right.
think the legal system prevents a lot of people from getting to that point, and we'll get into why in a little bit, but it's not as easy as like kicking this person out of the house or changing the locks.
Yeah.
I wish it was,
Yeah.
but it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Something I've talked about in the past, I think it was probably in training sessions, just as a way to try and understand a little bit more or be more compassionate as well, is that most relationships start in a loving, kind, respectful way. It's very rare that the day that someone meets a partner who eventually becomes abusive on that first day that they meet, that they're a complete jerk. Like that is, and treat them poorly and start the abuse right from hour number one. Like that's not how relationships start. So there is always this like kernel of truth or this foundation of once upon a time it was good. And if only we could get back there. Not everyone thinks that, but just that idea that it hasn't been bad right from the beginning. So that also makes it hard to walk away.
Mm-hmm. And we also know that violence escalates during separation or right after separation, and it's because the
Right.
perpetrator is losing control over the survivor, and therefore they escalate a lot of the tactics. So the coercive and controlling tactics is escalated, and it increases the level of abuse. It increases the risks of safety. And this is part of the reason why a lot of survivors try multiple times to leave an abusive relationship. And
Right.
it's not because they don't want to, it's just that things have escalated so much that it's not safe for themselves or it's not safe for their children to truly separate, despite wanting to take that step.
Yeah. And if someone has been controlling another person for possibly a very long time, and then all of a sudden their tactics aren't working anymore, and then they shift gears and they try something new and they escalate, the control and the power and everything, then the person who's being controlled and trying to leave is going to be thrown for a loop as well, because they're not going to know what that means. It's not going to be the regular rules of engagement. So they're going to end up having a harder time leaving at that point too, because they'll just be second guessing what's going to happen and what does this mean and what are the impacts and the repercussions. It's a lot of head games, but it's also, yeah, just really strategically hard to know when the right time is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another factor that can make it difficult to leave is the emotional abuse and gaslighting that the survivor experiences in the abusive relationship. And I think we've all heard gaslighting a lot being thrown around in the past couple of years. But what it is actually really difficult to explain or describe. And I think it looks different for different people. But essentially the way that I think about it is essentially blaming the other person for things that are beyond their control. So the perpetrator of abuse might say, I'm only mad at you because you didn't put dinner on the table, or the children are misbehaving because you didn't clean the house, or whatever it is. It's not true. It's often a lie and it's false. Um, but because it's said over time, many times over a number of years, it leads to the survivor to believe the abuser that it is true. Oh, he's mad because I didn't prepare dinner properly, or he's upset because the children are misbehaving because I didn't do something for them. And that's also really important to remember, because gaslighting and emotional abuse does wear down on self-confidence and the self-respect.
Yeah, big time. It's also possible to gaslight someone when lies are used. I think that's another way of thinking about it, because the person who's being gaslit might realize the other person had done something. I believe I had heard this, that gaslighting, the term came from a movie,
Yeah.
where the controlling person was turning down the lights and telling the woman that she was going crazy. And she's like, but I am sure you're the one turning down the lights. And now you're telling me that it's not happening. So that just that lie of that's not what's happening, or denying that they're doing something. It's at total odds with what the person thinks is happening. And then it just undermines their confidence and it plays into their insecurities. And it's very effective because we all do have insecurities about ourselves. And being lied to, being criticized, it plays into those insecurities and is very effective, but super, it's a really ugly way to behave with someone. Yeah, so I feel like that lying bit is the key piece. And then you don't know if the person is telling the truth or not. You really have to trust yourself. And that's hard to do when when your self-esteem's been worn down over time.
Yeah, there's been so many times where we have heard people say, "Oh, it's my fault because I didn't do
Yeah.
XYZ, whatever that XYZ is." But it's never their
Mhm.
fault. It's never their fault that, violence is happening. It's not their fault
Right.
that the abuse is happening. Another common thread for gaslighting is using the children as a weapon, saying like, you would lose custody of the children. If you leave me, so or I will get custody, just you wait, or you're a bad mom, you'll never get custody of the children. And a lot of the clients that we support do have this fear of losing their children, and they stay in the relationship out of fear that they would never get to parent their child.
Yeah, and you can see how effective a threat like that would be, because even if 90% of you believes that you have the law or the truth on your side or whatever it is, that 10% chance that the abusive person might end up with, full guardianship or something of the kids is just, it's too terrifying to risk. And so it makes the threat extremely effective, even if it's hard to believe that that's how it's going to go. Just the fact that there's a chance it could go that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So we spent some time talking about abuse during separation. Let's talk about what happens after separation and what violence can look like after separation as it relates to kind of the legal system. There are multiple ways where violence can continue after separation, and the most recent example we've used, where children are kind of weaponized against the survivor, is one of them. But there's other ways that abusers can use the legal process or the court process to exert their control, such as like not paying child support, which is something that
Mhm.
is a right of the child, making multiple court applications, forcing the survivor to respond to these frivolous applications, or not following court orders or agreements when it comes to parenting arrangements for the children. So we'll spend a bit of more time talking about this as we go through each of the episodes. But we wanted to highlight the various different ways that the family law courts can be used by perpetrators to further their abuse after separation.
Yeah. Again, it's a very effective but insidious tactic. I know, Vicky, you and I have been concerned in the past when we've done training about are we providing a playbook of some kind, something like that, like giving ideas to people who behave badly or who are abusive. And almost all of the clients or the support workers who work frontline, everyone that we've talked to are like, oh yeah, no, everybody knows about these things. And they're very natural things to do. Again, with the escalation of violence post separation, is just someone who's losing control and desperately wants to have it back will grasp at anything that they can to try and exert control or regain the power that they used to have. And using the court system is really hard, because a survivor might have been told or already knew that I just need to block the number and I'm going to stop communication. I'm just going to, isolate myself a little bit from that bad behavior so that I can have space and think clearly and all of that stuff. But the court processes require responses within certain time limits normally. And so if someone is filing frivolous or multiple applications or something, just doing whatever they can with the courts, then the person who's trying to protect themselves is not going to have a choice. They're going to have to engage. They're going to have to respond. So yeah, like you said, we'll get into all of that stuff a little bit more, but it's really tricky.
Yeah, this reminds me of something like you've pointed out before, Stephanie. about how the court process or the legal system presumes that there's equal footing between the two parties, and how these two people come to the legal system with the same type of resources, with the
Right.
same type of whether it's financial resources or like time commitment, like because court and the legal
Oh,
process
yeah,
takes a lot of time.
totally.
And it just makes all these assumptions that these two people are on equal footing, when we know that it's not true in an abusive relationship, that there is a huge imbalance of power, and that is why the relationship um, is abusive.
Yeah, yeah, the courts, I mean, it's kind of a nice idea. It's maybe a bit naive, but the idea that everyone's coming to the table with good intentions, that they're all coming to the courtroom to play by the rules and to really in good faith find a resolution. That is what most court processes are based on, that everyone wants to find a resolution. And what we've noticed is that a lot of abusive parties don't want a resolution. They want to win by attrition, or just win by waiting longer than the other party, or paying more money, just dragging it on, whatever it might be, just these kind of dirty tactics. And the courts don't assume that people are going to play dirty, so it's just not equipped. Yeah.
So that begs the next question: is why doesn't the legal system recognize this type of behavior? Why doesn't it recognize violence or coercive controlling behavior? And the answer to that is, within the Family Law Act in BC, there is a terminology for family violence. It is actually quite comprehensive. It identifies physical and sexual, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse.
Mhm.
So technically, there is nothing wrong with the definition of violence. I don't, from my perspective, it's not missing, um, a type of violence. It is quite comprehensive, but unfortunately, it goes back to the myth that we were talking about before, was that it still acts like a hierarchy of violence. So where physical and sexual abuse is considered worse than other forms of violence. But we know that that's not true. A lot of the people we have supported tell us, like, they can easily put up with the physical abuse, but it's the other forms that they're at wit's end about, whether it's financial control or isolation or manipulation.
Yeah, right. And it's very interesting, because I don't even know if the definition really uh, yeah, in theory, it's not a hierarchy, but in practice, I think it only is, because of the way that court proceedings unfold, in that there has to be evidence. So what evidence is there if someone is keeping their partner's wallet for safekeeping? They just can easily say, well, I had a better pocket in my backpack, like, going back to the earlier example.
Or she lost it once. What if she loses it again? I'm
Right.
just doing it for safety.
Totally. And then, you can understand, how are the courts supposed to evaluate that? How are they supposed to read into that tiny little moment where the power, shifted a little bit? It's a very hard thing for courts to evaluate. Whereas physical abuse or sexual abuse, we have evidence, physical evidence, that can be brought into a courtroom and demonstrated to the judge that this is what's happening. So, yeah, I understand why it behaves as a hierarchy. I just really want that to change. So, yeah.
Well, I think the problem is that the courts and the legal system look at incidences, like one incident on its own, as opposed to a
Right.
pattern over
Yeah.
time of coercive and controlling behavior. And so when we go back to our definition of what coercive and controlling behavior is, that part is missing. The pattern part, the cumulative over a significant period of time, is what is missing. this is not to say that like one incident of abuse doesn't equate to family violence, but that family violence also needs to include the pattern of behavior in order for people to the courts to recognize it. And it does, like in the legislation, it does identify a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior. So it's
Right.
again, in theory, it's there. It's just not utilized in practice.
Yeah. And I think the more we talk about it, which is part of the reason why we want to get this podcast out, is one of the ways we can improve this evaluation of what is coercive and controlling behavior is to recognize the pattern, to talk about it more, to bring it into the courtrooms. So yeah, I think that just recognizing that patterns are important, and that looking at more than one incident in isolation, looking at a number of incidents, even smaller issues over time, is going to give us a better picture of what's going on. And it will allow people who are survivors to explain what's happening with better language and a bigger understanding of what it looks like to be controlled.
Yeah. I think another concern that we have is the terminology in the Family Law Act, which is family violence. But it doesn't address the gendered aspect of gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. Like we said at the beginning, we know that women and gender diverse peoples are the ones who are more commonly victims of intimate partner violence, but the definition in the legislation just does not identify the gendered aspect.
Yeah, and we've spoken a lot with Dr. Alan Wade in Victoria, and he does a great job of analyzing the language and talking about how the term family violence is mutualizing. It suggests, by saying it's family violence, it suggests that everyone in the family has decided to engage willingly in this violent act or acts, and that everyone just came to the table and they're all participating willingly. And that we know that's absolutely not true, that violence is unilateral. It's one person doing it to another person against their will, and that's another kind of problematic piece, which we'll probably get into in later episodes as well. I think you also had some like euphemisms that have come up in your practice, Vicky, with the
Yeah, it's very interesting because a lot of people will describe the abusive episodes as, oh, we were fighting or we were arguing about something. And fighting and arguing are words that describe actions from at least two people coming together, or at least maybe not coming together, but they have some responsibility. Both people have some action into that fight.
Yeah.
But we know that's not true. So when I ask a bit more questions to the person I'm supporting, I'm like, well, how did that fight begin? Like, what caused that fight to initiate, or what caused you to argue? A lot of the responses definitely demonstrate that it was the perpetrator of abuse being reactive to something or being abusive, and then the survivor having either to defend themselves, and that's what caused this fight or argument. So a lot of times it's like,
asking them, could you have walked away from that fight or that argument? And when the answer is no, I could not get out of it, even if I wanted to, then that also is showing the power imbalance, the fact that it's unilateral, and that it wasn't really a fight or an argument. It was truly being controlled and being forced to be in that moment of violence.
Yeah. One of the examples, if we could just go back to, is like the financial one, is like there's going to be disagreements about how families use money. And I think like financial abuse comes into play, it's like, oh, we were arguing about money. And I was like, okay, well, what led to this argument? And she might be like, well, I wanted another $20 to go to the grocery store to buy more food. Right. Or I need another $50 because Sally needs a jacket, it's the winter and she grew out of her old one. And so
Yeah.
he got
Which
mad
you
because
wouldn't
I asked.
think, yeah, that shouldn't start a fight. That shouldn't start an argument, right? It's, yeah, it's not a
Yeah.
good sign. We have so much to say about this. It's a good thing we have multiple episodes.
Yeah. So maybe we'll just close there and say, while family violence, the definition as it stands in the legislation, is encompassing, there's a lot of work that we all collectively need to do to fully understand intimate partner violence or coercive and controlling behavior, because it's quite obvious that our legal system just does not do justice by the people we serve. And it doesn't allow survivors to fully explain violence. So sometimes when a survivor is like, well, he did X to me, sometimes our response can be, you can't say that in court.
You can't say that in court because they're not going to be able to know what to do with it. Yeah.
Or they're not going to understand because of all the myths and stereotypes that exist
Exactly.
in this fabric of society.
Yeah.
And so we spent some time today talking about myths and stereotypes. That's going to be a theme for us for the next few episodes. More common myths and stereotypes that are placed on survivors who experience violence. And so we want to thank you for listening to Rise's first ever podcast on You Can't Say That in Court. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Everything that we have said today is not legal advice. If you or someone you know needs legal advice, please consult with a lawyer. We want to acknowledge that this podcast would not be possible without the generous contribution by Women and Gender Equality Canada, Femmes et Égalité des Genres Canada.